Charitamrita. Jaya Jaya Sri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jaya Jaya Sri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. There's a couple of verses to read through and then we'll recite this one together. Text 169. Sri Caitanya Nityananda Dvaita Tina Jana Srivasgadadhara Adi-yata Bhakta Gana. While chanting the Panchatattva Mahamantra, one must chant the names of Sri Caitanya, Nityananda, Advaita, Gadadhara and Srivas with their many devotees. This is the process. Sabakara pada padme koti namaskara yaiche taiche kahi kichu chaitanya vihara. I again and again offer obeisances unto the Panchatattva. Thus I think that I will be able to describe something about the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So this verse here, please repeat. Shri Rupa Raghunatha Pade Yara Asa. Shri Rupa Raghunatha Pade Yara Asa. Caitanya Charitamrita Kahi Krishna Dasa. Caitanya Charitamrita Kahi Krishna Dasa. Shri Rupa Srila Rupa Goswami Raghunath Srila Raghunath Das Goswami Pade at the lotus feet. Yara, whose, Asha, expectation. Caitanya Charitamrita, the book named Caitanya Charitamrita. Kahe describes Krishna Dasa. Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. Translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada. Praying at the lotus feet of Sri Rupa and Sri Raghunath, always desiring their mercy, I, Krishnadas, narrate Sri Caitanya Charitamrita following in their footsteps. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wanted to preach the Sankirtan movement of love of Krishna throughout the entire world, and therefore during his presence he inspired the Sankirtan movement. Specifically, he sent Rupa Goswami to Vrindavan and Nityananda to Bengal and personally went to South India. In this way, he kindly left the task of preaching his cult in the rest of the world to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The members of this society must always remember that if they stick to the regulative principles and preach sincerely according to the instructions of the Acharyas, surely they will have the profound blessings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and their preaching work will be successful everywhere throughout the world. Thus end the Bhaktivedanta purports to the Caitanya Charitamrita Adi-lila, 7th chapter, describing Lord Chaitanya in 5 features. Om Gyan Timarantasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshushan Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpa Turubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvayevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Sivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So finally we've come to the last verses of the 7th chapter of the Adi-lila, describing the Panchatattva, the nature of the absolute truth in 5 features. Panchatattva. Panchatattva described simply are the personalities Sri Caitanya, Nityananda, Advaita, Gadadhar, Shivas, and then along with them all of their associates. So the process of becoming, how was it described? Competent to chant the Hare Krishna mantra is to chant this Panchatattva mantra, to get the blessings of the Panchatattva, because we're completely unqualified and contaminated and errant souls. We don't have the tendency to follow properly. We don't have the tendency to control our minds, control our senses, be respectful to authorities. So the qualification to chant Hare Krishna is not immediately available, but by invoking the mercy of the Panchatattva, by reciting Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, then that will give us the competency to chant Hare Krishna. And once we have, as following in the footsteps of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, once we have followed the basic process, once we have agreed to step into line in this process of Krishna consciousness, then the task of helping others to step into line is also incumbent upon us. A mammoth task to influence as many people as possible to wake up, to come to their senses, to realize their true nature, who they actually are. And it's not falling only on our shoulders, but by taking shelter of the supreme power, taking shelter of the supreme merciful Lord, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, then that task, that onerous task, becomes tangible, becomes practical, becomes successful. Srila Prabhupada describes in the purport that Lord Chaitanya, he set up the Sankirtan mission. He established the Sankirtan. He came and he demonstrated, he inaugurated the mission of chanting in the streets, chanting and dancing, singing, and glorifying the names of Krishna, Ram. The practices of chanting Hare Krishna were described very elaborately in this chapter. The reason why Lord Chaitanya came to spread this chanting, to understand the mood of love of Godhead which the topmost servitors experienced. Lord Chaitanya is Krishna himself, but he's appearing in the mood of his devotee in order to taste that flavour of love of God, the topmost flavour of love of God. So the spreading of the holy names, the allowing as many people as possible to come in contact with the chanting of the holy names, helps to further that mission, helps to uplift people. At a certain point in this chapter, he was instructed by his spiritual master. And he repeated that instruction. His spiritual master, he told him that how can you understand the Vedanta Sutra? How can you understand this complex philosophy? Just rather put your efforts into chanting the holy names, understanding the holy names. And then that will give you the purification, the clarity of understanding, the connection with Krishna, so that that knowledge becomes tangible. Just to become a dry speculator, just to become a scholar, a philosopher, is not going to help you or anybody else. Chant the holy names. The holy names. And within the holy names, there is all potency invested. If one wants to chant the holy names, one has to have the proper attitude. We were reciting before the Shikshastikam prayers. One should regard oneself as lower than the straw in the street, more tolerant than a tree, devoid of all sense of false prestige, and ready to offer all respects to others. So with this humble attitude, then it's possible that one can chant 24 hours a day. One can chant without cessation. So this is, and how often do we chant? How much do we chant? How much time do we spend using our tongue, our heart, our mind to glorify the Supreme, to glorify our beloved Lord? It's a measure. The less we spend our time, it's an indication of the lack of the humility, the lack of the purity, the lack of the tolerance, the lack of the ability to offer respects to others and not expecting respect for ourselves. So, in the beginning stages, in order to encourage us to get some impetus to practice these austerities, this chanting, this service mood, this mission, we take it as an obligation. We follow the direction, the guidance of our spiritual master. We find some spiritual instructions, and then we're grateful for those, and out of reciprocation, obligation, then we try and implement those instructions. And the instructions are very simple at the beginning, but as one becomes a little bit more adept, then the intricacies, the more intimate nature of those instructions becomes apparent, becomes available for us, so that the obligation to just do the externals, we can manage to feel comfortable with the rituals, the externals, the discipline. Then the sweetness which is available within those practices starts to become available to us. The sticking to the regulative principles and preaching sincerely according to the instructions of the acharyas is an aspect of this purport that I was going to speak upon. Srila Prabhupada, from his own personal experience, searching for the truth, as a youth, he joined the Gandhi movement. And he was raised in a family of pure devotees. But the atmosphere, the environment around him was not ideal. And his father would invite many saintly people to his house and would request, he would feed them, he would do his duty to honour them, and he would always request blessings from them, to get the blessings of the saintly people. And the blessings all constantly would be, can you bless my son to become a good servant of Srimati Radharani? Srila Prabhupada, he saw this coming and going of all these different standards of sadhus and saintly people, and he became a little bit tired of that. He wasn't so satisfied. Therefore, he adopted the Gandhi approach. And one of his friends persisted. His friend came in contact with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Srila Prabhupada's eventual spiritual master. And he implored Srila Prabhupada, please, at that time he was Aboy Charan, please come and hear this great saintly person. Prabhupada, he was reluctant. But his friend persisted, and then he was ushered into the association of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. They turned up, and even before he'd finished bowing down, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur described to him You look like eloquent, educated young men. You should dedicate your lives to understanding this message and preaching in the English language. First meeting, first instance of contact with a bona fide spiritual master. He didn't waste any time. He gave pertinent instructions. Srila Prabhupada, he was impressed, but because he had committed himself to the Gandhian approach, he felt obligated to challenge. How can you say like that? He in a respectful way, he asked his future spiritual, how can you say that this mission of spreading Krishna consciousness is going to be effective? We're still a dependent country. Politically, we're controlled by the British. But peacefully and gently, his spiritual master, he described to him that there'll always be some control, and it doesn't affect anything ultimately, because the governments will change, the political situation will change, who's in control will change. But the message of who is the ultimate Lord, what is the ultimate source of control, that is imperative. That has to be taught. That has to be distributed. That has to be presented. So Srila Prabhupada, after some time, he desisted from offering any opposition, and he related later that he felt deep within his heart that he had just met a very saintly person, and that the message of Lord Chaitanya was in very capable hands. And he was happy. He had probably at that first meeting, he accepted, here's my spiritual master, and he then spent the rest of his life trying to fulfill that original instruction. That instruction of his spiritual master, the instruction of the Acharya, the head of the institution, was cemented further in a letter which he received 2 weeks before his spiritual master left to rejoin the eternal pastimes in the spiritual world. And again, the same thing was repeated. Develop this English understanding and preach, so that you can then benefit the whole world, because at that time, then and still at this time, the English medium, the English language, is considered to be one of the major forces in the world. So then throughout his life he was meditating on this instruction, and then he managed to get to the West and begin to spread Krishna consciousness in very many novel ways. And the first instance was that he left India. Saintly persons were described, they shouldn't leave their country. It's dangerous to cross the ocean. You go out and you have to mix with many uncultured people. Stay at home. Stay in the association of advanced devotees. So he took that risk. Srila Prabhupada took that risk. Before that time, he had attempted to spread Krishna consciousness in India, to influence his countrymen. But he found that they were very reluctant, their understanding of the nature of absolute truth had become distorted by the influence of so many people who had come to conquer different governments, 1,000 years under the rule of the Mughals, and then 300 years under the rule of the British, and then also the influence of the impersonal teachers, the impersonal philosophers. So it was their determination had been watered down. Trying to preach in India, Srila Prabhupada, he managed to attract a few followers. He was distributing his magazine back to Gauri. He would meet people and he would describe to them, this is such an important mission, can you please just give me one son, give me one of your children that I can train up so they can also become an expert preacher. But people thought, well, what's the use of that? They were very reluctant. They wouldn't assist in that way. So Srila Prabhupada, he was hoping he could influence his countrymen But he had to first fulfill the order of his spiritual master. He had to go and preach in the English-speaking world. He went, and after many, many years of struggle, achieved success beyond his wildest imagination, and it's been noted by scholars and different observers that it was just unprecedented, the success that Srila Prabhupada had, to implant a traditional Vedic culture into the land of hedonism and sense gratification. And that has been achieved, and still now, 50 years later, it's still progressing, because his followers, Srila Prabhupada's followers, who are successful, who are not useless, who are not just followers in name alone, they are strictly following the regulative principles and trying to put into practice simply the instructions of their teacher, of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada, he very elaborately preached in the West, and on a few occasions he came back to India. He fulfilled the obligation that he had to his spiritual master. He satisfied that instruction. Coming back to India, it was his desire to preach back at home, and we went to when we were living in India, we went to the Calcutta Rath Yatra. Rath Yatra, which has 2 million people attending, and the streets are packed, and the whole city comes alive with Rath Yatra. So the devotees, they were putting a big effort into having a festival afterwards. And one of the speakers on the stage, he described that Srila Prabhupada, he would often say that if somebody went to different parts of the world and they spread Krishna consciousness, then Bhaktivinoda Thakur would personally come and deliver them. His grandfather, spiritual master, would personally come and deliver them back to Godhead and give them so many blessings, hundreds of blessings, thousands of blessings. Srila Prabhupada described that if somebody comes and preaches in Calcutta, his hometown, they will receive 10,000 blessings. Many, many more multiplied. Calcutta, Srila Prabhupada, he was competent. He said he was competent to preach in the West, the big cities, New York and places like that, because he was a seasoned Calcutta man. He developed his street wisdom by living in Calcutta. So one of the other limbs of his preaching mission was to develop and offer to the world the holy places within India. Sri Mayapur Dham, Sri Vrindavan Dham, and he had a big centre built in Mumbai. So the preaching in Mayapur is based on establishing a huge temple to glorify Lord Caitanya, and also it's based on the preachings that he developed, or he understood from his spiritual master. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur showed the world, and Prabhupada noted the diorama exhibitions. What are they called? The theistic dioramas. He would get different models, different dolls made, and they would describe one of the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya, or an aspect of the philosophy of the absolute truth. And so they were huge, and people could come along, and they might not be very philosophically inclined, but they could see how a pastime, an activity of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, or another aspect of philosophy is relevant to their lives. We had a few of those dioramas when we were doing some of our exhibits. One of the dioramas was changing bodies. You have different bodies that are living Indian habits, from the before birth to the baby, to the young child, to the youth, to the young adult, to the adult, to the mature adult, to the old man, the ailing man, and then the dying man. So there's all these different bodies, and we would have a little electrode, a little flashing light, which would indicate the soul which traverses through all those bodies. And people would come and stop, and they would think, wow, that's interesting. All those bodies, but there's one thing in common. That there's one thing that's permanent, that stays there. Another one of the exhibits was the karma diorama, with the bull and the slaughterman there with the axe ready to slaughter the bull. But when you look closely, the bull has a man's head and the slaughterman has a cow's head. So people would look and think, oh yeah, that's normal, that's what's going on. But then they take a second look and they come back and they think, wow, what's happening there? And then they get a deeper realization, well, I'm involved in this activity, so in the future, then that's my karma. I'll get that same situation. It's a very, very effective way of presenting the philosophy.